All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on something pretty fundamental when it comes to keeping any organization secure.
Yeah.
Security architecture reviews. And you shared a really comprehensive report with me from U.com ARI. It's dated March 2025, and it covers a ton of ground, right?
It really does. Yeah.
Everything from like essential checklists to all the intricacies of cloud security posture management, common vulnerabilities we see out there, the tools people are using, and how it all kind of ladders up to CIS compliance.
Right.
So our goal today is to really unpack all this stuff so you come away with a clear understanding of how organizations evaluate and strengthen their security defenses.
Yeah.
And maybe even a few surprising insights along the way.
Absolutely. And I think, whether you're someone actively involved in cybersecurity strategy or you're prepping for a discussion where security risks might be on the agenda, or even if you're just curious about the behind-the-scenes efforts to protect all the digital assets we rely on, this deep dive should give you a pretty structured and insightful perspective.
Yeah, for sure.
So we're going to be focusing on the security architecture review, checklists, CSPM, vulnerabilities, tools, CIS compliance PDF. It was provided by U.com ARI in March of 2025.
Okay, so let's start with the basics, right? Like when we talk about a security architecture review, or we use that fancy acronym SAR,
Right.
what's the core idea here? What fundamental problem is an organization actually trying to solve by going through this whole process?
Yeah. At its heart, a security architecture review is, really a systematic and in-depth examination of an organization's entire security framework. And the report makes it clear this is not just about, ticking boxes or going through the motions. It's really crucial for, proactively identifying those weaknesses that could be exploited, assessing the real risks an organization faces, and making sure that all those security controls that they have in place are actually aligned with their business objectives and any relevant regulations they need to comply with.
So it's like a detailed health check, but for an organization's security posture, right? It's not just looking for existing problems, but also potential future issues.
That's a great analogy. Precisely. And, this check isn't just a quick glance.
Right.
This report really emphasizes that effective SARs have to delve deep into vulnerabilities and, everything. The hardware that underpins their operations, the software they rely on, how their networks are configured, who has permission to access sensitive information. It's a truly comprehensive look across the entire security landscape.
The report you shared lays out this pretty extensive 9-step process for actually conducting a review.
Yeah.
Sounds like quite an undertaking. Let's break that down.
Yeah, let's do it.
Starting with step 1. Defining the scope.
Yeah.
What does that really mean in practice? What are you actually doing?
So defining the scope is the foundational step. It's absolutely critical for making sure this whole review is successful. You can't analyze everything at once.
Right. Yeah.
So defining scope means, according to the report, you have to clearly identify the objectives, like what are the specific systems, the applications, the networks, the data involved in this review.
Okay.
And then how does all of that support the organization's business goals, their risk profile, and any compliance mandates that they have. And a really crucial part of this is identifying all the key stakeholders. Who are the individuals, the teams that need to be involved in this process, and who needs to be kept informed along the way?
Makes sense. You got to set those boundaries, understand the why behind the whole thing before you even start looking for those weaknesses, right?
Exactly.
So what comes next?
Okay. Step 2 is understanding the current state. This is where you roll up your sleeves and really get into the nuts and bolts of the existing security architecture. The report highlights the need to assess how the network is currently designed. How is everything connected? How does data actually flow within the organization? And what are the access control mechanisms that are in place?
Okay.
So this stage also involves a very thorough review of the network's physical layout, all of those configurations of the systems, and the security policies that are supposed to be guiding their operations. Really importantly, this step also means gathering all the existing documentation. So network diagrams, those security logs, incident reports, anything that can provide valuable context and maybe highlight some potential red flags.
So it's like taking a detailed inventory of the security landscape, right?
Right.
Creating a baseline understanding before you start poking around for weaknesses.
Yeah, exactly. You need that solid foundation to build on. And I think the next step, perform threat modeling and risk assessment, that's where it starts to get really interesting in terms of anticipating potential problems.
Yeah. Threat modeling. It always sounds like you're trying to think like the bad guys. Is that the idea?
That's exactly right. The report mentions specific methodologies like STRIDE, which helps to categorize threats based on common attack vectors. There's DREAD, which focuses on scoring those risks based on things like, damage potential and how easy is it to actually exploit that vulnerability.
Okay.
And then PASTA, which takes a more attacker-centric view to figure out all those different paths an attacker might take.
Right.
So this step is all about mapping out what we call the attack surface.
Okay.
So that's all the points where an attacker could try to get in or exploit a weakness.
Makes sense.
And then you evaluate both how likely those threats are to actually happen and how bad would it be if they did.
Okay.
This really allows the organization to prioritize. Okay, let's focus on the most critical stuff first.
Okay, so you've identified the potential threats, you figured out how serious they could be. What's the next logical step in this 9-step process?
So that would be gap analysis.
Yeah.
This is where the organization takes what we just talked about, the current state, and they compare it to industry standards and best practices.
Okay.
The report mentions ISO 2000-01.
Yeah.
That's that big information security management framework. NIST 853, that one's got a catalog of security controls for federal systems. And then, of course, CIS Benchmarks, which give you specific configuration guidance for different tech.
Okay, I see.
The goal here is to identify any big gaps in their controls, their policies, their configurations that could leave them vulnerable. And what's really interesting here is that these gaps, they're not just technical, right?
Right.
It often reflects decisions the business has made or where they've chosen to prioritize things. It really highlights that security needs to be woven into the fabric of the organization.
That's a good point. It's not just about missing a patch here or there. It could be a much deeper fundamental misalignment.
Exactly.
So once you've found those gaps, what happens next?
Next up is to evaluate security controls. So this means taking a hard look at how effective the existing security measures are in different areas. How well are they managing? Who gets access to systems, those IAM systems? How quickly are they applying software patches? And are they monitoring for suspicious activity? Are they actually watching for threats?
Right.
The report's really clear here. Don't just assume a control is working. You have to validate it.
Yeah.
Make sure it's actually doing what it's designed to do. Just because you have a security tool in place doesn't mean it's providing the protection you think it is.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
You have to test if those security measures are doing their job.
Right.
Okay, so after you've identified those gaps, evaluated the controls, what's next?
Now we're talking develop recommendations.
Okay.
So based on everything we've learned so far, this step is about coming up with specific, actionable solutions to address those vulnerabilities. The report says these recommendations, they need to be prioritized, right? Based on how much risk they're reducing and the potential impact on the business. And it's also key to make sure that these solutions, they fit in with all the compliance stuff like GDPR, IPA, PCI DSS, all those acronyms, and they integrate with the systems the organization already has.
Yeah. So it's not just about pointing out the problems, but also showing a clear path forward with solutions that make sense for that specific organization, right?
Exactly.
What's step 7?
Step 7 is to create a roadmap. This takes those recommendations and turns them into a plan you can actually execute. The report really emphasizes the need for clear timelines for when things will get done and a breakdown of the resources, both people and money, and then key milestones to track progress and make sure you're staying on track. It's about moving from where you are now to a more secure future, but in a practical, manageable way.
A well-defined plan is critical. And then you have to tell everyone about it, right? Step 8, report findings.
Absolutely. This means putting together a comprehensive report that summarizes everything, clearly outlining those risks, the potential impact, the recommendations, and that roadmap we just talked about. The report also talks about how important it is to present these findings to the right people in the organization. The CISO, the security architects, IT managers, business leaders. Clear communication is key here to make sure everyone understands the issues, the proposed solutions, and why it's so important to take action.
And finally, step number 9, implement and monitor.
Yeah. This is where the rubber meets the road, where we actually put those changes into place.
Yeah.
But the report is clear. Implementation is just half the battle.
Right.
You have to constantly monitor those changes to make sure they're working as intended and watch out for any new vulnerabilities that pop up. Security is not a one-time thing. It's a constant cycle of assess, act, and refine.
I like that. That 9-step process really gives us a structured way to think about these reviews. Now, the report also goes into some best practices for effective SARs. What are some of the key principles that really make a SAR impactful, make a real difference?
The report lays out 9 best practices that really elevate a SAR from just checking boxes to a real strategic security initiative.
Okay.
So the first one is to adopt a holistic approach. Don't just look at isolated technical pieces, take a broad view. Everything: networks, applications, endpoints, the cloud, the data itself. Think about the entire ecosystem to make sure security is baked into everything the organization does.
No siloing those security concerns.
Exactly.
What's next?
Number 2 is leverage industry standards and frameworks.
Okay.
We touched on some of these like NIST, CSF, ISO 27000 on those CIS benchmarks.
Yeah.
The report's really pushing for using these established guidelines, not just for the review itself, but to make sure the organization's security is aligned with all those regulations like GDPR, IPMA, PCI DSS.
It's like, why reinvent the wheel if there are proven frameworks to guide you, right?
Right.
Okay, best practice number 3.
Number 3 is engage stakeholders. This means getting those key people and teams from different parts of the organization involved throughout the process.
Okay.
So we're talking security architects, developers, IT folks, business owners.
Yeah.
This ensures a much more comprehensive review. You get all those different perspectives, and it really creates a sense of shared responsibility for security.
Absolutely. When everyone has skin in the game, security becomes a much bigger priority.
Exactly.
Okay, best practice number 4.
Number 4 is incorporate threat modeling proactively. We talked about this as a step in the process, but it's also a best practice in and of itself.
Right.
So while it's a key step, it shouldn't just be a one-time thing. Embedding threat modeling as a regular practice, constantly thinking about how systems could be attacked, that helps you find and fix those risks early on instead of waiting for problems to happen.
You're baking security in, not bolting it on as an afterthought.
That's the idea.
Okay, what's the 5th best practice?
Number 5 is conduct regular reviews. The report makes it clear that the threats are constantly changing and the organization itself is changing.
Right.
So SARs shouldn't be a one-off thing. They should be done regularly, at least annually, and even more often if there are big changes like mergers or new systems.
You gotta stay ahead of the curve, constantly adapting. Right?
Exactly. Okay, number 6.
Number 6 is utilize automated tools. This is all about using tools to make the SAR process more efficient and effective.
Okay.
There are tools that can scan for misconfigurations, find known vulnerabilities, assess compliance. Automating those tasks frees up your security team to focus on the more complex stuff, the things that really need a human touch.
Yeah, it's about scaling the security efforts, right? Making the best use of everyone's time.
Absolutely.
That's number 7 on the list.
Number 7 is focus on continuous improvement. A SAR should be seen as input into an ongoing process of improvement.
Use the findings and recommendations to fine-tune your policies, processes, controls, and adapt as the threats change.
It's about building a culture of security where everyone's always learning and getting better.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, number 8.
Number 8 is document and communicate findings effectively. This is all about accountability and making sure everyone's on the same page. Keep detailed records of the whole process, clearly communicate those findings to all the stakeholders. That helps drive action and get buy-in for improvements.
You need that paper trail, and you need to bring everyone along on the journey.
Exactly.
And the final best practice, number 9.
Number 9 is fortify the security team. This is about making sure you have a strong team that can actually handle all this.
Okay.
That means having subject matter experts who really know their stuff, and it means providing training to keep them up to date. A strong security team is the foundation of a good security posture.
Absolutely. Those best practices really paint a clear picture of what an effective SAR looks like. The report also details the key components of those SAR checklists. What are some of the things you would typically find on one of these checklists that's guiding the whole review process?
So checklists, they're like your roadmap, making sure you don't miss anything important. One key component is security baseline and compliance. You're verifying that the organization's doing the basics, following industry standards, complying with regulations, and sticking to their own internal security policies.
Just making sure you've got those foundational elements covered, right?
Exactly.
What else is on the checklist?
Another big one is access management. This is all about controlling who has access to what.
Yeah.
Are they using strong IAM controls? Is everything documented? Are they following the principle of least privilege?
Right. Controlling access is obviously super important.
Absolutely.
What other key areas does the checklist cover?
Well, there's configuration and network security, This is about making sure systems are configured securely, traffic is controlled, and workloads are hardened.
So you're minimizing the attack surface and making sure those communication pathways are secure.
Precisely. And of course, we can't forget about data protection. This section is about making sure sensitive data is encrypted, properly classified, and stored securely.
Protecting that data is paramount. What about the organization's ability to, detect and respond to those inevitable security incidents?
That's covered in the monitoring and incident response section. You're checking for a comprehensive monitoring strategy, well-defined incident response procedures, and making sure those workflows are automated as much as possible.
It's not just about prevention, it's about knowing what to do when something does go wrong.
Exactly.
What about keeping track of all the security activity? Is that on the checklist?
Of course, that's audit trails and logs, making sure those logs are detailed, capture all the important events, and are reviewed regularly.
So it's like a security system with a memory.
Yeah, a good analogy.
And finally, the last checklist component.
The last one is continuous improvement. This is about making sure security is always evolving, always getting better. Do they have processes for regular audits, code reviews, vulnerability assessments? Are they adapting to the changing threat landscape?
Security is a journey, not a destination.
Well said.
These checklist components really provide a solid framework for conducting a security review. Now let's talk about cloud security posture management, or CSPM. Why is that so critical in today's world where so many organizations are moving to the cloud?
As organizations move their stuff to the cloud, those traditional security approaches often don't cut it.
Yeah.
CSPM is crucial because it gives you the tools and processes to manage and improve the security of all those cloud assets.
So it's about taking those core principles and adapting them to the cloud, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And the report highlights some key aspects of CSPM. Continuous monitoring is a big one. CSPM tools are always watching your cloud environments for misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, compliance issues. They give you real-time visibility into what's going on.
Real-time monitoring sounds essential in the cloud, where things can change so quickly.
It really is. And then there's misconfiguration detection and remediation. These tools can automatically find common misconfigurations like exposed storage buckets or weak access controls, and often provide ways to fix them quickly.
Automation is key in the cloud, especially with how complex it can get.
Absolutely. And there's compliance management. CSPM tools can help you map your cloud setup to all those different regulations like HIPAA, GDPR, SOC2, ISO 27701, you name it.
Streamlining compliance is a huge win. But what about all the alerts and potential issues that can come up in a large cloud deployment?
That's where risk assessment and prioritization comes in. These tools analyze all that data from the cloud, figure out how serious the risks are, and tell you what to fix first.
It helps you focus on the most critical stuff.
Right, exactly. And finally, there's integration with DevOps and CI/CD pipelines. This is about integrating security earlier in the development process.
That shift-left approach we hear so much about.
Yep. These CSPM tools can be integrated into those pipelines to enforce security rules, find issues during development, and even scan infrastructure code before it's deployed.
It's about building security in from the ground up.
That's right.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, the report also talks about some of the most common and critical vulnerabilities to focus on during a review. This seems like a really important section for our listeners.
Absolutely. Understanding what those vulnerabilities are is key to a good SAR. The report breaks them down into different categories, starting with network vulnerabilities. These include things like misconfigured network devices, which can open up access to attackers, unencrypted sensitive data being transmitted over the network, vulnerabilities that can lead to DOS attacks, which disrupt those critical services, and of course, man-in-the-middle attacks, where an attacker can intercept and potentially mess with communications.
All of those sound like they could have some pretty serious consequences. What about vulnerabilities within the applications themselves?
Those application vulnerabilities are another big target for attackers.
Yep.
The report talks about things like SQL injection and cross-site scripting, which can allow attackers to run malicious code or get access to data. Weak input validation, insecure APIs, even those hidden backdoor programs. Securing applications is incredibly important.
They're a major target for a reason.
Yeah.
What about the operating systems running all these applications and services? Are there vulnerabilities there too?
Yes, those fall under operating system vulnerabilities. The biggest culprits here are unpatched software, systems that haven't been updated with the latest security fixes, configuration errors like using those default credentials or having weak permissions, are also big problems.
Yeah, basic security hygiene goes a long way. But it's not just about technology, right? There are human vulnerabilities to consider as well.
You're absolutely right. The report emphasizes those social engineering tactics like phishing emails, where attackers trick people into giving up sensitive information.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's the risk of just plain negligence or lack of awareness, especially with more and more people working remotely.
Right.
Humans can often be the weakest link.
It's a good reminder that technology is just one part of the equation.
Uh,
What about the processes an organization has in place? Are there vulnerabilities there?
Definitely. The report calls these process vulnerabilities, and they can be just as bad as technical flaws.
Okay.
So things like not having a well-defined incident response plan, weak access control processes, not enough security monitoring. You can have the best tools in the world, but if your processes are weak, you're still vulnerable.
Yeah. Processes and technology need to work together. The report also touches on cloud and IoT vulnerabilities. Given how prevalent both of those are, what are some of the key concerns there?
So cloud misconfigurations are a big one. Things like publicly accessible storage buckets or overly permissive access rights.
Okay.
And for IoT devices, which are often built with a focus on cost and convenience, you see things like default passwords, unencrypted communication, and a lack of security updates.
So many new attack surfaces.
Hmm.
And the report even mentioned vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. That's a scary thought.
It is. The report highlights vulnerabilities in those PLCs, industrial control systems, the things that run our power grids and water treatment plants.
Right.
Attacks on these systems could cause major disruption. There's also the threat of false data injection attacks and ransomware targeting critical infrastructure.
Yeah, those could have devastating consequences. What about the cryptographic methods used to protect data? Are there vulnerabilities there as well?
Yes, those are cryptographic vulnerabilities. Using outdated or weak encryption algorithms can leave your data vulnerable. And if you don't manage your encryption keys properly, that undermines the whole thing.
Weak encryption might as well be no encryption at all.
Right. And then there's the idea of vulnerabilities in security controls. It seems counterintuitive, but your defenses can have weaknesses too.
Right, right.
A lack of MFA is a big one.
Yeah.
Even if you have strong passwords, without MFA, your accounts are much more vulnerable. And weak security policies can create loopholes. Your defenses are only as strong as their weakest link.
Makes sense. And finally, looking ahead, the report talks about emerging threats. What are some of the key trends on the horizon?
Well, the cyber threat landscape is constantly changing. One of the biggest trends is the use of AI and ML by attackers.
Yeah, that's scary.
It makes their attacks more sophisticated and harder to detect. We're also seeing more malware specifically targeting those industrial control systems. Staying ahead of these threats requires constant learning and adaptation.
It's an arms race. So the report talks about the best tools for SARS and CSPM. What are some examples of tools that can help with those traditional security reviews?
The report gives a few good examples. There's Checkpoint Infinity Global Services, which provides a holistic evaluation of your security, not just the tech, but also the processes and policies.
Okay.
There's GuidePoint Security Architecture Review, a managed service that focuses on finding those systemic issues and aligning security with your business goals. And then Sentinel-Alone Singularity Vulnerability Management, which uses AI to find those security blind spots and prioritize what to fix.
So a good mix of options. What about tools specifically for CSPM?
For CSPM, there are some great options. There's Orca Security, which is agentless, so you don't need to install anything on your systems. It analyzes attack paths and prioritizes those risks.
Okay.
There's Prisma Cloud, a really comprehensive cloud security suite that includes CSPM, workload protection, compliance management, the whole package. Sysdig Secure is really good for securing those containerized environments in Kubernetes, providing runtime threat detection and compliance monitoring. And then Microsoft Defender for Cloud, which integrates seamlessly with Azure and uses AI for threat detection and risk prioritization.
Lots of great options out there. Finally, let's talk about CIS benchmarks and compliance standards. What are they and why are they so important?
So CIS benchmarks are basically a set of security configuration guidelines for all sorts of IT systems.
Okay.
They're developed by a global community of cybersecurity experts, so they're very well respected in the industry.
So like community vetted best practices for security.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They cover over 140 different benchmarks across 8 different tech categories.
Wow.
And they offer different security levels depending on your needs. Importantly, they're also mapped to a lot of major compliance frameworks like NIST, CSF, ISO 27001, PCI, DSS.
So they can really help with demonstrating compliance. What are some of the benefits of using them?
They help reduce the attack surface by recommending ways to disable unnecessary services and tighten up configurations. They improve your overall security posture by setting a strong baseline.
Okay.
And they simplify compliance efforts because they align with those regulatory requirements.
It's about making your systems more secure, establishing a solid foundation, and navigating the compliance landscape. How are they actually used during security reviews?
So you typically start with an assessment. You evaluate your systems against the relevant benchmarks to see where you're not meeting those recommendations.
Okay.
Then you implement those recommendations, hardening your systems, and then it's all about continuous monitoring to make sure you stay compliant.
It's a cycle of assessment, implementation, and monitoring. The report also talks about how CIS benchmarks align with other compliance standards. How does that work in practice?
Well, they complement each other really well. For example, with ISO 27001, the benchmarks provide those specific technical guidelines you need to meet the standards requirements. There's also a direct mapping between CIS controls and the NIST cybersecurity framework, so you can implement those NIST recommendations more easily.
Right.
With PCI DSS, the benchmarks are often referenced for securing systems handling cardholder data. And while GDPR is focused on data privacy, implementing those benchmarks can indirectly support compliance by making those systems that process personal data more secure.
They really do seem like a versatile tool for improving security and compliance. And what about tools to help organizations apply and maintain compliance with CIS benchmarks?
Yeah, there are some good ones out there. CIS Cat Pro is a tool that can scan your systems and generate reports on your compliance status.
Okay.
CIS hardened images are pre-configured virtual machines that are already compliant, which can really speed up deployment.
Nice.
And there are commercial tools like SymTrack and Manage Engine Network Configuration Manager that automate the process of assessing and remediating compliance.
So a lot of ways to streamline that compliance process.
Well, this has been a really deep dive into the world of security architecture reviews, pulling from all that great information in the U.com ARI report. For our listeners, there are some clear takeaways.
Yeah.
SARs are not just a quick scan. They're a multifaceted process. They require a structured approach, understanding those potential threats, a commitment to constant improvement, and collaboration across the organization. And CSPM, that's essential now for organizations using the cloud. And frameworks like CIS benchmarks, they give you that concrete guidance for strengthening your security.
It's really fascinating to think about how the increasing sophistication of cyber attacks, especially with AI, and those new threats targeting critical infrastructure, how all of that will force security architecture reviews to evolve even further in the coming years.
Yeah, it makes you think about those emerging threats, right? Like we talked about AI being used by attackers. But what if we could leverage AI on the defensive side to actually predict those attacks before they happen? That's a really intriguing thought. Could we develop AI-powered security systems that are constantly learning and adapting, that can identify and block those attacks in real time?
Yeah,
That would be a game changer.
it really would. Well, this report from U.com ARI definitely gives us a lot to think about. For our listeners who want to dig deeper into any of these areas, the original report is definitely worth checking out.
Absolutely.
Until next time, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.